morning, everybody, and welcome to today's session. Just before I begin, could I just, as a show of hands, just confirm that everybody can see the screen and that everybody can hear me? Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay. So just to begin and introduce myself, I do know some of you and have met with some of you before, but my name is Nikki Hardwick. I'm an HR consultant from HR Talk, and I have been with HR Talk for almost 20 years now. Today's session, we're going to be talking about managing misconduct, incapacity, and poor performance in the workplace. If you would like, you're more than welcome to post some questions in the chat, and I will get to them at the end. Unfortunately, I can't see them in the session as I am going, but I will get to them at the end when we get to the end of the presentation. Okay, so as I've mentioned, within my role as HR Talk, I've been dealing with very many cases, various clients, in dealing with misconduct, incapacity, and poor performance. And one of the things that I find, excuse me, that is very often an issue is that people don't understand how the legislation works and what the requirements are of an employer in order to ensure that something is dealt with fairly. And so today, what I'm going to be doing is just going through a couple of things with you to try and get to the point of understanding what is required of an employer, what are some of the key issues, and what should be being done by the employer to ensure that if it gets to the end of the process, and the end is generally at the point that we get to a dismissal, is what would be deemed to be fair if it was going to be challenged by CCMA or bargaining council. So when I look at some of the problems that are often faced by an employer, so very often the place that I get involved is generally when we're getting to the end of a process. So an employer would have dealt with the employee or would have done certain things, possibly letters, meetings, discussions. We could even get to the point where we're now at a disciplinary hearing or we're at an incapacity hearing, but I'm generally involved at the end. And 9 times out of 10, what I find is that when we get to the end and there's a problem, it's generally because of these types of things. So the first thing that I find is that people don't understand what discipline means and don't understand the purpose of discipline. And so what happens is with discipline is it's done poorly. People also don't seem to understand what the difference is between dismissing someone for poor performance or incapacity versus dismissing someone for misconduct. And then you've obviously got the operational requirements. So some of the examples that often I find there that we get very, very lost in, and a person will go down the process of disciplining someone, going down the process of disciplining someone, for example, for sick leave. And so what happens is we go down the process, somebody has given the person warnings, we've gone all the way to the end, only to establish that the person should have been following an incapacity process. We might even get to the point that the person is dismissed for misconduct, when in actual fact it's an incapacity issue. Alternatively, what happens is we sometimes get to the point where we've got an employee that we don't want for whatever reason, and whether it be the person is not well, whether it be that they're messing up, there's poor performance. Generally it's not a misconduct issue, but we have the person that they've been there for a very long time and we no longer feel that they're a good fit in the organization. We have sufficient evidence or documentary proof to go down the road of, let's for argument's sake, say poor performance, but we don't want to do that because we feel bad for the person. They've been there a long time. It's just really not working. And so we try and move down the road of operational requirements and retrench the person. And what happens in that space is it creates such a risk for the organization, because the requirements in terms of fairness, when we're looking at dismissal for poor performance or incapacity, misconduct, and or operational requirements are so different and so varied that if you go down the road, even if you're trying to be nice to someone by retrenching them, if they challenge you at CCMA or bargaining council, you're going to have a big problem. And so it's really important that as management and anyone that is dealing with any kind of issue, and remembering when we're talking about these things, this doesn't only come into play at the time that a person is going to be dismissed, but this actually starts to come into play right in the beginning, because everything that we're going to be doing could be challenged at the end when we eventually get to dismissal. Okay. We also have a poor understanding of what progressive versus punitive discipline. So very often what people don't seem to understand is that, and this also comes into the understanding of discipline and what it means, is people don't understand at what point do I progressively discipline versus what point is it punitive discipline. So just for the purpose, and I'm not going to go too deeply into discipline and progressive versus punitive, but there's a very real confusion I find with people not understanding at which point do I go straight to a disciplinary hearing versus, do I have to give someone 3 warnings if they are, I don't know, stealing from me? At what point can I start with a verbal warning and slowly work my way up versus at what point can I just say enough is enough? And so often what I'll find is I go in and you'll have, within discipline and specifically within misconduct, one of the things that is very key is what have we done in the past? Now, when we look at any sort of progressive versus punitive, CCMA and, the Labour Relations Act requires that we should, where possible, try and fix the behaviour through the use of discipline. But that's not always the case. If somebody has been derelict in their duty, I'm not going to give them 3 or 4 chances to get it right before saying enough is enough. It's the same as dishonesty. If someone steals from me, I'm not going to give them 3 warnings to give them 3 chances to steal from me, because if I allow them 3 chances, I must allow everyone else 3 chances. So it's very important that as management and supervisors and anyone that is dealing with employees, that we understand that there's a very clear and defined space in which there are things that you can progressively discipline, i.e., you are doing something wrong. And in doing something wrong, I want to talk to you. I want to try and give you an opportunity to try and correct the behavior. And so what I do is I progressively discipline. I start with something small, possibly like a counseling. I move to a verbal warning if you still don't listen. I then slowly pick up the pace with the hope that as the discipline becomes harsher, your behavior may change. Punitive discipline, on the other hand, is that whatever you have done is so severe that I need to give you a harsh punishment right off the bat. Okay. The other thing that I find is a problem is poor record keeping. And this specifically comes into play when we're dealing with, possible progressive discipline, and or where you've been dealing with employees, but you've been having conversations that have absolutely nothing in writing to back them up. I'm not saying that every time we have a conversation, do we necessarily need to put it in a form, but when things start to become a little more serious or a little bit more formal, is we do have to, at some point, put something in writing. And that could be a confirmation of a discussion. So it could be an email that goes out saying, hi, Nikki, just confirming that we've had a conversation today, and we had this conversation. This is what we discussed. This is what is going to happen. This is what we've agreed upon. And this is when we're going to follow it up. That just helps you from a point of view where we now need to put a case together because the person is not listening, or whatever the story is, and we put a case together. So it doesn't have to be in formal documentation. It just has to be somewhere that you can record that the person has received it, and that you've actually had the conversation. Sorry, there's a question. Can everyone else hear me? So Shanice cannot hear me. Can everyone else hear me? Okay, just give me 1 second, guys. Okay, Melanie, you can hear me? All right. Shanice, I think it might be, thank you, guys. I'm just going to type here. Okay, sorry about that. Technology is great. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so continuing on from there. Okay, then also, as I've mentioned before, is not following the correct procedures based on the type of issue. Okay, so that basically stems in from this point over here, which is not understanding the difference between dismissal for poor performance, incapacity, and operational requirements. Again, I'm going to go back to, it is incredibly important that you understand what is required if you're going to get to the point, remembering that when we eventually get to CCMA or we get to bargaining council and a dismissal is challenged, what they're basically looking for is, has a fair process been followed? Okay, so they're wanting to know, did you follow a fair process? So in getting to the point of dismissing this person, did you follow the fair process? And that fair process is defined in the Labour Relations Act. So they want to know, did you do what you needed to do? Now, again, going back to, I get to a disciplinary hearing, I'm a chairperson, I have no knowledge of what has happened. I'm sitting in a disciplinary hearing only to find that we're dealing with an incapacity case, but we've got a disciplinary hearing, or it's, a poor performance. Actually, generally what happens is any type of poor performance or incapacity, most people deal with under misconduct. And as I go through the requirements now, I'm hoping that it's going to unpack for you why it's so serious, or at least why it's so important, not serious, why it's so important for everybody to understand. And what I want to be clear with as well is that as management, I would highly recommend that what you do is you start to train. If you've got supervisors, if you have people even at a lower level that are required on a day-to-day perspective, required to manage employees, even if it's a case of they're not necessarily, they can't sign off warnings and that sort of thing, is for people to understand how to deal with the three different types of things. So operational requirements, generally people at a lower level are not going to get involved. But when we're dealing with poor performance, incapacity, or misconduct, at a lower level, people need to understand how to deal with these things, because if they don't, and they don't understand the difference, the information that is fed back to you, if you're the one making the decision, is always going to be skewed based on their level of understanding of where they need to go. Okay, so I would highly recommend that you do, little short courses, mini trainings, whatever it is, so that people can understand the difference. So when the conversations are being had, when the record keeping is being done, when emails are being followed up with and sent and that sort of thing, the right process is being followed. Okay, so if we then move on to slide number 3. Okay, so now if we look at the Labour Relations Act, so Schedule 8 of the Labour Relations Act specifies for us the different types of dismissals and specifies for us the different types of ways that we need to approach dismissals. Now they have dismissals for, they do talk about probation, so I'm not going to deal with probation now, but there's 4 different types of actually 5 different types of dismissals. I'm not going to go into operational requirements, which is anything to do with if you needing to retrench someone. That is where you're not going to be having general managers trying to deal with this sort of thing. But the first one that we have is a dismissal for misconduct. Now, when we define misconduct, what we're looking at is it's anything in which an employee has either failed to act or has acted and it implies some sort of fault on behalf of the employee. So they have done something or not done something which has caused something for the employer. So they have broken a rule. So any kind of misconduct implies a fault. Now, you can have negligence that falls within misconduct. So negligence and poor performance are often, confused a little bit. I'll get into poor performance now, but negligence, although very often negligence can be a mistake. So it wasn't my intention to do whatever it was that was supposed to be done. I made a mistake. So, for example, in negligence, I could accidentally, when making a pay away, put an extra 0 on the pay away and, pay away too much money. My intention was not to pay away too much money, but I didn't follow a rule, which was I needed to check my payaways as an example. So that even though it wasn't intentional, it was still a break in the rule, and you as the employee should have done or known better. So any kind of misconduct is an act or omission to act by an employee, and it implies fault on behalf of the employee. Okay, so in essence, the employee has broken a rule. Then we go on to incapacity. So incapacity and poor performance are interlinked. With the difference, however, is that incapacity relates to a person's ability on the grounds of ill health or injury to do their job. So incapacity is where an employee is temporarily unable to work. So in other words, they are incapacitated on the grounds of ill health or injury. Poor performance, on the other hand, is that an employee is unable to perform their duties despite training, guidance, and counseling and work standards provided. So in other words, if we look at incapacity and poor performance, the person, there's no fault on behalf of the employee. So as somebody who is sick, if I am too sick to come to work, if I'm going to deal with illness in terms of misconduct, remembering we go back to misconduct, misconduct is dealt with in terms of discipline. Remembering in discipline, what am I trying to do with discipline? I'm trying to discipline you in the hopes that your behavior changes. So by giving you a warning, even if it's a verbal warning, I'm saying to you, stop doing that. So let's take late coming, for example. So I've spoken to you now a couple of times. I now say to you, I'm done speaking to you, you're not listening. And so I give you a verbal warning or a written warning. I'm hoping by giving you that, it is going to fix your behavior. And obviously, if it doesn't, I then escalate it and I escalate it further. If we look at incapacity, and again, at this point in time, what we're not doing is we're not assuming that everybody is full of nonsense and they're lying. We're going down the road of saying the processes are very clearly defined. Now, incapacity, when a person is temporarily unable to work, i.e. they are too sick or too injured to work, doesn't matter how many times you give the person a warning, it's not going to fix the fact that they're sick. So if I discipline you for taking too much sick leave, forget about whether the person, is lying or whatever. If the person is genuinely incapacitated, they've been booked off work and they are not well, I can give the person as many warnings as I want. It's not going to fix the situation. And so it's very clear in that space that misconduct and incapacity are two very different processes. Now, when we get to a disciplinary hearing, remembering discipline, and in the thing there, I've got a charge which says taking too much sick leave. If I fire the person, that is not going to affect the person's ability to get better. The same as when we go to poor performance. Now, again, with poor performance, we're making the assumption, and there's processes to be followed, that the person is unable to perform their duties. So I've given them training, I've given them guidance, counseling, all of those sorts of things in order to allow them to do their job. And despite all of those things, they're still unable to do it. So they're not skilled or qualified, or they don't have the ability to do it. So now again, we go back to, if I'm going to give you a warning and say, you better do this job better, it doesn't matter if you're unable to do it, you're physically incapable of doing it, despite all of those things. It doesn't matter how many times I warn you, if you cannot do it, you're not going to be able to do it, even if I give you a warning. And so now we start to see very clearly the differences between incapacity, misconduct, and poor performance. The background noise, 1 second, give me 1 second. I'm going to mute and pause 1 second for Okay, sorry about that, guys. I am speaking to everybody about putting the background noise off. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on. Okay. Alrighty, okay, then we get to probation. So like I said, I'm not going to go too deep into probation, but when we look at probation, just to be clear, one, you have to have a probationary period within the contract, but the purpose of a probationary period is to test that the person, so between the person and the employer, there is a good fit. So the purpose of probation is to create a space in which we can assess and quantify whether that person is going to be able to fit. So the requirements within probation, to dismiss or at least terminate the person's employment are slightly lower than if we look at any of the other requirements. So just to be clear, people often will say, what is the purpose of having a probation? There's literally no point. A probationary period, if managed correctly, is very useful to an employer, understanding that within probation, a probation is not a standard 3 months. Probation is defined by your position, and is defined by how long it's going to take me to adequately know whether or not you're going to be able to do that job. So if I am coming in as, let's for argument's sake, say a receptionist, it may be sufficient for me to determine that you're able to do your job within 3 months, as an example. If I'm employing you in a slightly, like let's say a financial manager's position, 3 months may not be sufficient. I might need 6 months. What is clear, though, within probation is that you cannot just get to the end of the period and decide that you're not happy. There must be conversations. There must be things that you've had conversations with the person. But as an example, within probation, if the person begins to take too much sick leave, if they're late for work every day, if they're just not meeting the requirements, we can have a conversation and take all of those things into account to determine that the person is just not a good fit. So within probation, I don't necessarily need to go down the road of the incapacity process because it is a brand new employee and they are within the probationary period. Okay. So, and then, sorry, just to be clear, that in as much as I've mentioned these four, there is the operational requirements, which is very separate. So the Labour Relations Act does specify the operational requirements as a fifth element. So please don't forget about this one. But in terms of managers and management of employees on a day-to-day basis, these are generally the four that people end up having to deal with. Most of the time, as I've said, people will automatically go down the misconduct route, regardless of whether we're dealing with sick leave, poor performance, whatever it is, that's their go-to place of where they need to go to. Now, it is not correct all the time. The fact that someone is taking sick leave and the fact that you think that they might be lying doesn't mean that you can automatically go down misconduct. As it presents itself in the beginning, that is your first point of call, is if it appears to be misconduct, then you must go down. Remembering misconduct, there's a rule associated with that. There is something that you either break or don't break. There is a defined act or a mission to act by the employee. Incapacity is I'm too sick to come to work. Just remembering, sorry, just to be clear at this point, is that if a person takes off work, so I am off for 3 days, okay, and I'm off as a result of sick leave. So I come back to work and I have a medical certificate. However, I didn't phone as per the rule. I can give someone a warning for failing to phone. I don't give them a warning for necessarily being off on sick leave because I have a medical certificate. So sometimes it can be a combination of the both. You just need to step back and realize, at which point, what is it that you're actually looking for? Okay. So in terms of, one of the questions at the end of probation, do we need to have a hearing? You don't necessarily need to have a full inquiry. So you wouldn't have to have a full inquiry. You could have a meeting, remembering the requirements within, probation are less. But with that said, though, even in misconduct, there's no requirement to have a formal disciplinary hearing. So as long as you within probation have told the person what it is that you're saying, so why are you deciding that you don't want them anymore? What is it that they have done wrong? Then what you would do is you would say, Nikki, you have been here 3 months, you come to work late 15 times. We've spoken about this. You don't bring your stuff in. We've given you the training. You were sufficiently trained. You're off 3 days a week because you're not well, whatever the story is. We are not happy. You are not meeting the requirements. We are considering terminating your employment within your probationary period, but we want to give you the opportunity to tell us why we shouldn't. You must then consider that and then decide thereafter. But there's no requirement for you to necessarily bring in witnesses and all of those sorts of things. You're giving Nikki the opportunity to say what it is that she thinks. You then consider it, remembering that within probation, provided it is within your contract, it is a point at which you are determining that the person is either a good fit or not a good fit. Okay, again, anything can be tested, so it is important that you do have the evidence. Let's just put it that way. You can't just say things having never had a conversation and never spoken to the person. You can't then just have a meeting and decide that the person is not for you. You have to follow principles of fairness. You have to, much the same as you would like to be treated, you have to treat people the same way. Okay. There was another question. So what will an incapacity inquiry fall under if the employees are just not able to do the work? So that would fall under poor performance. Poor performance is so remembering, incapacity is the person is unable to do the work due to ill health or injury. Poor performance is I'm here, I can come to work, I'm here, I'm doing the work, I'm just unable to do it. So I physically, regardless of how much training or guidance or counseling, I tell you what you need to do, you are sufficiently trained to do the job, but you can't. You just don't meet the standards. Okay. So hopefully that has explained it. Then the other question is what happens if an employee says clinic only gave them a medical for a week, but is off for a week? So I assume what happens if the medical certificate is off for a day, but the employee is off for a week? The reality is that the legislation says you need to provide a medical certificate. If you don't, then I'm going to assume that, if you were booked off for only 1 day, and you didn't come back to work after a week, the rest of the time will be you were absent from work without authority or without good proof, and therefore I'm going to assume that it's misconduct. Okay. Alrighty, so I'm just going to try and move this so everybody can see. Just 1 second. Can everyone see the slide sufficiently? So there's nothing blocking the slide. Okay, just 1 second. Okay. Belinda, I'll get to your question now. Okay. So just if we look at, I'm going to go through the different principles of fairness, just in terms of medical certificates and overriding the Labour Relations Act, or at least the basic conditions. The basic conditions provides a minimum at which every single employer, unless you fall underneath a bargaining council, you need to comply with. So if we just look at the medical certificates, the basic condition says that you need to, in order to be paid for your sick leave, if you're off for more than 2 consecutive days or more than twice in an 8-week period, I, as your employer, may request that you provide me with a medical certificate. Otherwise, I do not have to pay you. Okay. Now, we cannot, as employers, ask employees to give me anything other than that. So I can't make it worse for them. So remembering that what we're doing now is we're saying to people, if you've been off for 3 days, you must provide me with a medical certificate. Otherwise, I don't have to pay you. So there is a negative effect there for the employees. I cannot put in a policy that says you must give me a medical certificate every time you're off, or every Monday and Friday, because I'm negatively affecting the employee. I cannot do something that is contrary to legislation or worse for the employee. The same as I go, basic conditions allows for 15 days of leave. I can't say to someone, even if we agree, you're only going to get 10, assuming that they're working 5 days a week. So I can't change the legislation to my benefit. So especially when that benefit is going to negatively affect the employee. Okay, so a company policy cannot override the basic conditions, especially if it is going to be negative to the employee. Okay, so they cannot insist on a sick note when it falls over a Friday or Monday or a public holiday if insisting on that medical certificate is going to affect the employee's pay. Because the basic conditions is very clear. You can only request a medical certificate which will then affect the employee's ability to claim their sick leave. So in other words, from their 30 days of paid sick leave, you cannot request that medical certificate, and if they don't provide it, affect them negatively, especially if it is contrary to the basic conditions. If you've got somebody who is taking too much sick leave, then my recommendation is that you start to look at a sick leave ratio, you start to look at identifying patterns, and then what you do is you follow the legislation in order to treat them fairly. Applying the Monday-Friday rule is not necessarily going to find the people that are messing around. If you apply the twice in 8 weeks rule, or if you find someone who is taking excessive sick leave, and excessive sick leave can be found out according to the sick leave ratio, you can't negatively, if it's contrary to legislation. Just bearing in mind that this is basic conditions we're talking about. You have bargaining councils that have different rules. So you need to check where you are in order to assume that it's either correct or not correct. Okay, so if we then go into fairness, so I'm going to go through the different aspects of fairness. Now, as I've said from the beginning, if we're going to go from right from the beginning, depending on what has happened, and we get to the point of dismissal. As we get to the point of dismissal and it is then challenged, if it is challenged, what is going to happen is CCMA, bargaining council, are going to look at what we've done, go, okay, this was misconduct. Did they follow the right process in terms of labor relations? Or hang on, this is incapacity. Have they done what they needed to do? So these are the things, the principles of fairness in terms of the Labor Relations Act that are defined when we get to the end of it. So it talks about what would a fair dismissal look like. So if we look at a dismissal, so this is a dismissal for misconduct, as it says a dismissal, regardless of the reason, must comply with a fair reason. So you must have had a sound reason for taking disciplinary action, and a fair process or procedure must have been followed. Okay, so these are the requirements. So when we're looking at any type of dismissal for misconduct, there are two things that they're going to look at: the substantive fairness and the procedural fairness. That is in essence what they look at. They go, was there a fair reason, and did you follow a fair process or fair procedure? Those are the two requirements. Okay, now the requirements in terms of incapacity and poor performance are different. So when we look at procedural fairness for misconduct, so we need to make sure that we have a disciplinary rule or standards that the employees must comply with. Okay, that is what we need to do. So if you don't have disciplinary rules and regulations, you need to put those in place. I would assume that everybody would have them. What is also quite important is to make sure that employees are, I'm going to go with regularly, but employees are regularly reminded of the disciplinary rules and regulations. So whether it be at the beginning of the year, every 18 months or so, what we do is we remind people of the rules and regulations so that at no point can they come back and say that they didn't know, they weren't aware. Remembering that in some instances, you can have people that have been with you for 8, 9, 10 years, and they break some rule that is not a sort of common practice type of rule. And then they make the claim that it was so long ago that they don't even remember. Okay. So my suggestion is that you have some rules in place, remembering that not all rules, not every single thing that a person can do can automatically be included in every single rule of the employer. It is a general standard of conduct that is required by employees. It provides them with a general standard that they need to comply with. Okay, in terms of procedure, where possible, corrective discipline rather than punitive should apply. So your disciplinary code will also specify for you the general flow at which things should happen. So when we're talking about late coming, where generally do we start? Do we start with a dismissal, or do we start with a verbal warning? Where are we going to go? And that's to try and create a standard by which every sort of manager and whatever tries to go down that road of ensuring that it's fair. Obviously, and as I said before, not every single, and the Labour Relations actually specifies this, is not every single transgression that is out there is automatically going to start with progressive. If someone steals from you, if someone assaults someone, if there is any kind of, sort of anything serious, so serious that it breaks the trust relationship, you're not going to give people 3 chances in order to do it again before you dismiss. So some transgressions are serious enough that you would go straight to a disciplinary hearing. Okay, your disciplinary code should also specify, at what point do you go to a disciplinary hearing? Do you go at final written warning stage? I've had some disciplinary codes that say, even if we're going to go to a verbal warning, you go to a disciplinary hearing. I wouldn't recommend it, but you need to, in your code, be quite clear is that for any transgression that possibly is going to result in dismissal, we will have a disciplinary hearing. Anything leading up to that, we can have a disciplinary meeting. It obviously also needs to specify the rights of the employee. So do they have the right to an interpreter? Do they have the right to legal representation or internal representation? What are the requirements, and what are the rights that are afforded to an employee undergoing disciplinary action? You must conduct an investigation. You must notify the employee of the inquiry or the hearing with reasonable time to prepare. Remembering that a disciplinary hearing is part of your, so it's not your investigation, but it is that meeting that's going to happen in which the employee is given an opportunity to defend themselves. So you need to allow the person time to prepare. They also need to know what it is that what they've been charged with, or what it is alleged that they have done. They cannot come to the disciplinary hearing with a charge that says negligence, because at no point do they know anything of what that, what does that actually mean. They must be allowed time to respond and have the assistance of either a trade union rep or a fellow employee. When I say trade union rep, I mean a shop steward, if there is one and it's recognized. And they must be given the reason for dismissal. So now, in terms of the Labour Relations Act, that is what is specified in terms of procedural fairness. So those are the things that are required in order for us to have procedural fairness. Okay. Again, we say here that misconduct applies some sort of fault on behalf of the employee. Okay. Then if we go to substantive fairness, so what we're looking at, was it a fair reason? So did we have fair reason for the employee to be dismissed? So did the employee break the rule? If yes, was the rule valid or reasonable? Was the employee aware that, or could have possibly be reasonably aware that the rule existed? So as an example, I don't necessarily need to have a rule in place that says that you cannot, grope people in the passageway. I don't have to have that one, because reasonably we all know that that should not be, well, at least I hope we do. We all know that that's not acceptable. I don't need to have a rule that says you can't steal money, for argument's sake. Those rules are helpful, but there are some rules that people should reasonably have been aware that they were in place. Has the rule been consistently applied, and is dismissal an appropriate sanction? Okay, now we go into, so just to go back very quickly, so these are the procedural fairness rules. So this is what is required if we get to the point of a dismissal under misconduct. These are the substantive rules. Did the employee break the rule? Was it valid, etc., etc.? So this is if we're looking at fairness for a dismissal for misconduct. Okay, now we get to poor performance. Remembering that poor performance is we are dealing with a no fault. So poor performance, we are making the assumption right in the beginning that the person is unable to do the job. Remembering that with poor performance, very often what may happen is a person may not be meeting the required standards. In the beginning, we're not entirely sure if it's the person's choice to do it. So are they just not doing their job because they don't want to, or is it something that they're unable to do? In order to establish whether it is a cannot or a will not, we have to start with the poor performance route. Okay, so we begin the process by starting with the poor performance routes. Now, in this space, there needs to be procedural fairness and substantive fairness. Now we start to see the difference between a dismissal for poor performance and that of misconduct. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to conduct an objective assessment. So we need to establish, what is the employee doing? What should they be doing? So it must be an objective standard or objective assessment so that we can determine where do we need to go from here. Secondly, we need to provide appropriate training, instruction, guidance, and counseling in the work standards required. Remembering, at this point, based on the objective assessment, we may establish that the person doesn't need training. So if the person comes into the job and they have 20 years of experience, they've been working in the field, they know exactly what to do, they shouldn't need additional training. So shouldn't have to redo that training. They might need instruction in terms of this is how we work in this company. They might need guidance or whatever it is. It might even be a space of it's a brand new job and they just need a little bit of time or whatever it is. But your objective assessment is going to determine what it is that you need to be providing in terms of training, instruction, guidance, and counseling. You must give the person reasonable time to improve. Okay, so what is reasonable time to improve? That is going to be subjective. Okay, that is going to be dependent on the job itself. Much like I said with probationary periods are not a stock standard 3 months. Okay. What that basically is we would need to determine in the job. So let's take Nikki, for example. Nikki has been doing this job for 20 years. She now comes into my organization and she is not performing. I then do my objective assessment and I establish that, for argument's sake, she should know all the stuff that she knows, but she's struggling to fit in with our systems. So I now give her some training on the systems. We then do an assessment afterwards. Nikki, how are you feeling about the training? No, I think I'm fine. It should take me a little bit of time just to get used to it, but then I should be fine. Okay, so how long is that going to take? Well, I'm adequately skilled in computers. I know what I'm talking about. So a month should be fine. So in that discussion, this is assuming that Nikki is being helpful in the process, but a month should be fine. During that month, I may have follow-up meetings to go, okay, well, you said that you'd be fine. Let me have a look. What is going on here? And we start to now unpack whether or not Nikki is performing better, is she not performing better, what is actually going on. Throughout this process, what may happen is we may start to tick off the boxes that say, one, Nikki's had the appropriate training. So in terms of Nikki versus everyone else in this role, she has enough training and she's done whatever she needs to do. I've instructed her on what is required. I've given her guidance. I've given her counseling in the work standards required. She's been given reasonable time to improve. During this whole process, I've looked at investigation. I've investigated reasons for poor performance, remembering that sometimes poor performance also comes from outside reasons. So it could be something that relates to external factors, not necessarily internal factors. I have done all of these things. So let's assume Nikki is not a new employee. Okay, so take that off the table. Nikki has been doing this job for 20 years and suddenly I now start to not perform. I've established all of these things. I've put things in place to ensure that Nikki should be where she needs to get to. I've also eliminated the possibility that Nikki is not just being negligent in her duties, so she's working as hard as she possibly can, and that'll only be established when I start to have regular meetings and regular feedback sessions and I'm talking to Nikki. I will then be able to unpack, is this a will not or is this a cannot? Assuming I'm still going down the road of a cannot, so I've established that there isn't anything and Nikki is just now no longer capable, I must then consider, now here comes the thing, is one of the things that they say is that I must consider a job transfer. It doesn't say I have to do a job transfer. It says that I must consider a job transfer. So now when I sit with Nikki and I say, we've done all of these things, we are clear that it is not a will not, so it's not misconduct. We now need to have a performance hearing. And in that performance hearing, one of the things that could possibly come up is to say, okay, we all agree, Nikki, you can no longer do that job. So now what we do is we say, well, actually, what we have considered is you're still a valuable asset to this team. You're still really, really great. But what you can't do anymore, for argument's sake, is you can no longer do the management side of your job. You can still do the consulting and that sort of thing, but you can't do the management side. We would love to keep you, but there's this new job over there. Would you like to take it? And so we go down the road, and let's assume I say yes, or I say no, whatever it is. If I say no, then we say, well, unfortunately, you can't do this job. And so we are going to make the decision to terminate your services. It is a no-fault termination because it wasn't my fault that I couldn't do the job. It was just one of those things. And so it is a no-fault termination. If it goes to CCMA, they are going to have a look to say, did the employer follow these things? Did we do everything? One of the things they're going to do is say, well, did you consider alternatives? Was there anything else that you could have done? We say, yes, we actually did. We looked at this other job. We offered it to Nikki and she said no. Alternatively, there could be nothing else. There is actually no other job. So, but we did consider it. We looked at various jobs around here, and unfortunately, there wasn't anything, but we did consider various things. As with the other one, fellow employee and trade union rep can also assist. But I think the key thing here is if we go back to misconduct, and we look at what is required, there is no requirement within procedural and substantive fairness within that section that when we get to the point of dismissal, that we need to consider a job transfer. There is no requirement. So now if we go down the road and we have a disciplinary hearing and we call it disciplinary hearing for poor performance, when it gets to CCMA, the question is going to be, was this a hearing for misconduct or was it a hearing for poor performance? Okay. Now, if they find that actually you have followed the wrong process, there is going to be a problem. Okay. So I see a couple of questions coming up here. Okay. All right. So I'm going to get to the polygraph test just now. All right, so the one question is when an employee is not currently meeting the standards, but has previously shown themselves to be capable, there's no justifiable reason for underperformance. Should this be treated as poor performance and misconduct? That is going to be dependent, remembering, as I said, generally when somebody has been performing for a very long time and suddenly stops, there's generally a reason that's possibly not relating to work. It could be an outside factor. So, and that outside factor could be a social problem, a personal problem that is affecting the person's ability to do their job. It would still be a poor performance thing, unless, of course, you found out that you put things in place to assist and guide the person. So as an example, what I often put in place is when a person is not performing, very often what will happen is people will say, I'm just too busy. I've got too much work to do. I'm too busy. The rule that I then put in place is to say, okay, that's fine. I understand that you're too busy, but if I give you a deadline, my expectation is before you don't meet the deadline, you have to come and tell me. At that point, I'm then able to look at the work that you've got and able to discern, are you too busy or is there another problem? If the person does not come and say anything to me, then what they're starting to do is to now break a rule, because I'm giving them options, I'm giving them an out, I'm providing them with support which they're choosing not to do, and then I start veering towards possible misconduct because I'm trying to assist you and you're choosing not to take the help. So I think it's a little bit, you would need to look at each situation. But at that point in time, when you're looking at someone who has performed previously and is not performing now, my first point would be to go down the road of assuming that there's an outside factor, there's something else that is going on. Once I've had the conversation, and the conversation could very well be, you've always been great, you're not so much anymore, what is going on, can we assist you? If they continue to insist that there isn't anything, and you've eliminated any not poor performance, any of the training, guidance, counseling, you know that none of that's a problem, then I would start to go down the road of misconduct, but you just need to do the investigation. Okay. Is the trade union allowed in a poor performance inquiry? Yes. So remembering it's the trade union, the representative, so not unless you, so it's the shop steward. But anytime there's any sort of action against a person, they're allowed, if they're part of a union, they're allowed to be represented by their shop steward. Okay. Could an alternative job allow for a lower salary? Yes, 100%. If I'm going to take away half your job, then 100% it does allow for a lower salary. So as Nikki, if I'm taking away Nikki's management of her job, I 100% can take away would say, well, Nikki, I can offer you this job. It's half of what you did before, but it comes with a salary. Would you like it? It is my choice then to decide whether or not I wish to take it. Okay. If I choose not to take it, even at that pay, because remember, I can't have my cake and eat it. I'm going to be doing less of a job. Okay. If I've decided not to take it, then the only alternative is for the dismissal to take place. Okay, so the employer is not put in a position where they have to offer something. Remember, they must look at what they can offer, but not necessarily say, well, this is the only thing. We have to find something. We have to create a job. There is a requirement that you must consider a job transfer. If there is nothing and you can show that you have considered it, then then you're fine. But you have to show that you have tried that. There is another question. If the employee declines the alternative job and you arrive at the decision of terminating, is the employer required to pay notice? Yes, you are required to pay notice. Because it is a no-fault termination, remembering that the relationship is not broken as a result of trust. So the person can actually continue to work in that job, their job, whatever it is, for the month of their termination. I know you may not want them to do so, but the relationship from a trust perspective is not broken. And so there is no reason for a summary dismissal. Okay, so in all fairness, you would be terminating them with notice because they could continue to work that month, do handovers and that kind of thing. Okay. If we then look at substantive fairness, so in terms of substantive fairness for poor performance, what the questions that are asked is, has the employee failed to meet a performance standard? If they have, was the employee aware or reasonably aware of the standard? Has the employee been given a fair opportunity to meet the required performance standard, and was dismissal the appropriate sanction? Okay, so now there you can start to see, so in terms of substantive fairness, it's kind of the same as misconduct. The key issues here is what was the requirement from a procedural fairness. Then we get into incapacity, which is one that everybody seems to, we always veer back to. It's a question that is always coming up in any of the trainings that I ever do, is this elephant in the room of incapacity and people taking advantage of sick leave. So now we look at procedural fairness. Okay, so if we're going to get down the road of terminating a person for incapacity, is the key issue here is that when this is done correctly, the process can work. But I do want to say that most people who are terminated for incapacity, so when we go down the road of incapacity, most people who abuse the system are probably not genuinely sick. But what happens is people go down the road of misconduct because I think that everybody or most people are abusing the system. And so I want to discipline people for taking too much sick leave. I want to discipline them because I'm hoping that their behavior, because I think that they are just, messing around. So I try to discipline them in the hopes that they will come right. The problem is that I'm either going to get to the point with misconduct where I'm sitting on a final warning for taking too much sick leave, I have to dismiss the person. That person goes off to CCMA and says, look, I was fired for taking too much sick leave. CCMA is going to go, but hang on a second, have you followed the procedural fairness for incapacity, which is basically when you take sick leave? The answer is going to be no. And in terms of looking at the procedural fairness for dismissing someone for incapacity, you're going to have a big problem. Okay. So in terms of procedural fairness, and I see a question has come up, but in terms of procedural fairness for incapacity, one, we need to establish, is there a pattern of intermittent sick leave or lengthy absences from work? Okay. We do not have to wait until 30 days is up for us to start this process. If you implement your sick leave ratio, which I did a mini training on last week, but if you start to implement regular assessments of sick leave ratios, what you will start to identify is where there are problems. So people who are beginning to take too much sick leave. Now, my definition of too much sick leave versus yours may be different. My opinion is as soon as someone starts to take sort of more than 2 days every 2 months, it becomes a problem. Not necessarily that everybody is messing around, but someone who is sick every 2 months, there is a problem. And so I start to begin the process of investigating, not assuming that everybody is lying, but going down the road of saying someone who is sick every 2 months, there is a problem. And so for me, the pattern of intermittent sick leave or lengthy absences, I do a check every 3 months to see if anybody starts to get over that line. Then what we need to do is we need to investigate the extent of ill health or injury. How do I do that? I chat to the person's doctor, obviously with their permission, to determine, hey, doctor, this is what is happening with Nikki. Please, can you tell me if Nikki is able to do this job? Okay, so this is what she does. You know what's wrong with her. Please, let's have a look and see if she can do the job. I then ask the doctor, is the employee capable of doing the work that is required? If not, to what extent? So the doctor said, oh, hang on a second. Now that I know what Nikki does, I've realized she actually can't do all of this job. So if you take away 0.1, 3, and 5, for a period of 3 months, she should be better after that period of time, and then she should be back to her normal state. Or actually, I know what's wrong with Nikki. I've seen her job. She's fine. She can do her job. Or actually, Nikki can't do the job. At whatever point it is, unless it's Nikki can do the job, I look at this and I then start to go, okay, so the doctor said she can't do 1, 3, and 5. I then now have to look at, has the employee's work circumstances and job been considered for adaptation or modification? Okay, so can I accommodate Nikki not doing 1, 3, and 5 for 3 months? Or is it she's never going to be able to do those things? Can I accommodate her in that space? Yes, I can accommodate Nikki for 3 months. It will be difficult, but I can do that. Well, I can't do that. Then I need to look at, has the availability of a suitable alternative been considered? So let's assume 1, 3, and 5 is Nikki's management ability. Can I take that away? I can't really, because somebody else needs to do that. Nikki, I can take that away from your job and I can offer you this job at a lower level. Your doctor says you can do these things. Would you like to take that? It does come with a drop in salary. Would you like it? No, I wouldn't like it. Okay, terribly sorry, but I can't accommodate you over here. And so unfortunately, I have no alternative but to dismiss you. Okay, so if we have a look here for incapacity, there is a process that we need to go through to now start looking at job adaptation, looking at how I can, because remembering again, in this space, it is a no fault termination, or it is it's not the employee's fault that they are sick. And so as the employer, we are required to try and do things to make it easier, obviously within reason. Now, if I have a disciplinary hearing, you can see how this becomes a problem. Okay, so the obligation is that I need to look at the work circumstances. I need to decide whether or not I can accommodate that. Is it reasonable? Even if the person is going to be off for a month, can I accommodate that? Not necessarily paid time off, but can I keep the person's job open for a month? Have I done everything that I possibly can to allow the person time off to recuperate or whatever it is and come back? If I fire the person for taking too much sick leave, then I'm going to have a problem because I haven't done what needed to be done here. Okay. We've got a question. Can we still proceed with incapacity if the employee refuses to give us the details? Yes. Okay. So remembering over here, so point 2 is, has the extent of the employee's ill health or injury been investigated? So at that point, Remembering that a medical certificate doesn't need to define for you what is wrong with the person. But when we get to the point that they are taking excessive or lengthy absences from work and it's beginning to impact on you as the employer, I need to go to the employee and, in line with the Labour Relations Act, say I need to have a conversation with your doctor or send you to a doctor. I refuse to go. Okay, you're not giving me anything to work within, so I don't know how to, I don't know what parts of your job you can or can't do. You're just not coming back. So I have no idea if you can or can't perform the work. I can't adapt work circumstances, so I cannot help you. But the reality is that you are not coming to work. You are unable to perform your duties. And based on what I can see, we go to an incapacity inquiry. We answer all of these questions here, and we say the employee will not engage with us. He cannot fulfill his duties in line with this contract due to whatever is wrong with him. And so we have done what we can, and unfortunately, we are now going to terminate for incapacity. Okay, so you do ideally want the person to be involved with you, because then you can see how you can possibly help them. But if they don't want to give consent, then there's nothing that we can do. Then we must go on the information that we do have, and we proceed like that. Okay, you can send an employee to a doctor of your choice. Again, if you're going to be asking for reports from the doctor, whether it be their doctor or your doctor, one, you do need their consent, because no doctor is going to give you anything relating to their medical without their permission. Two is you do need to pay for those reports. Okay, so if you're asking for medical reports, if you're asking for them to go to the doctor, then you do need to pay for that. Obviously, if the person has a history of illness and they go to the same doctor, and that whatever the illness is a specialist type of thing, ideally you want to deal with their doctor, because they know their history. So sending them to a brand new doctor is not going to help. But the key thing here is the questions that you're asking the doctor. Saying to a doctor, Nikki's an HR consultant, she can do the job, is not useful. So you need to be giving the doctor proper information about what Nikki does on a day-to-day basis. You need to be giving information that is pertinent to whatever is possibly wrong with Nikki. So the questions you need to be asking need to be pertinent to what it is that you're actually trying to extract from the doctor. Okay. Then if we go to substantive fairness, so the substantive fairness starts to ask the questions, is the person capable of performing the work? If they're not capable, we need to look at the extent to which the person is able to perform the work. Have we looked at whether the work circumstances are able to adapt or accommodate the disability, and where not, can we adapt the duties, and are there any available suitable alternatives? So these are the questions that are then asked to determine whether or not the dismissal is fair. Okay. So just very quickly, in terms of our overview, we've got misconduct, which is you're disciplining people to teach them to obey your rules or your code of behavior using punishment to correct the disobedience. It implies the fault of the employee. Poor performance and incapacity, there is no fault. But in poor performance, we need to ensure that the employee understands the requirements, allow time to improve, provide training, and consider a job transfer. Incapacity, the employee is unable to perform their duties. Remembering that in this space, and the inability to perform their duties, they could perform a tiny little part of it, but majority not, or a key aspect of their job they're not able to perform. We need to then look at, can the modifications be made to the position, and can an employee be offered an alternative position? So poor performance and incapacity is no fault. It is not the fault of an employee. It is not a discipline issue. So going down the road of misconduct when dealing with poor performance or incapacity is a bad idea, because of the requirements in terms of fairness when looking at poor performance and incapacity. Okay, so where it goes wrong, like I've said before, Jenny has failed to perform her duties, which has resulted in a loss to company. What we then do is we go gross negligence or dereliction, which is a dismissal. CCMA determines that it was poor performance and not negligence. We didn't do an objective assessment. We didn't provide appropriate training and guidance. The employee was not given reasonable time to improve. Investigations or reasons for poor performance were not considered, and neither were the job transfer. And so when it goes to CCMA, we now have a problem because we followed the wrong process. Okay. In terms of progressive versus punitive, again, what I want to say is over here, it's quite important that employees and employers at least understand what the difference is between the two, is that we need to understand that progressive discipline is what we are trying to do is teach employees how to behave. Okay, minor transgressions, so something, and generally when I talk about disciplining in the workplace, is as employers, if anybody has children, is the way we discipline our children is we don't, or hopefully not, we don't go in guns blazing for something that can be dealt with a conversation. The way that we discipline and we treat our children, hopefully, is with fairness. So we'll have conversations. Some instances we might issue harsh punishment, others it will be, here, let's learn and develop. The same thing applies in a work situation, is that we need to get to the point that we are treating people fairly. You also wouldn't, with your kids, continue to verbal warning, verbal warning, verbal warning, verbal warning, when it's clear that they're not listening and that the punishment you're giving is clearly not making any effect. So in terms of dealing with progressive versus punitive, it's important to look at what has happened to decide how you are going to do that. One of the key things with discipline in the workplace and misconduct and fairness is, have you followed the right process? Okay, so that brings us to the end of our presentation today. I do hope, and we will share the slides with you, and it will be available on YouTube. I do hope that this has helped you. Again, what I want to say to everybody is a key aspect for me, and what I find is a problem, is that very often when we have people who are foremen, supervisors, that sort of thing, that step into the place of having to manage day to day, they don't understand how it happens, and they don't understand what they need to do. So they go down a road and they treat people, and in terms of what is going on, most people will veer towards discipline, and by the time it comes across your desk, you have a problem. Okay, so it's important to train managers on the difference between the two, or at least the three different types of things, and making sure that they understand what is required. Okay. All right, so that brings us to the end of today, but the slides will be sent off. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a lovely Easter to those who are celebrating. We will see you soon. Please feel free to email me. If you have any questions, my email address is nikki@hrtalk.co.za. That's NICKY@hrtalk.co.za. Thanks, everybody, and see you next time.